Okay, good morning. Welcome, everybody, again. It's nice to see so many known faces again. It's very, very nice. So, thanks, Leo. Thanks, our guests, Professors Hart, Catherine Gibson, and Akinobu Kurada, that I don't see him. Yes, please stand up so we can also see your face. He's our main speaker for tomorrow. So I will briefly wrap up or give you some information. As you can see, we have two screens with the PowerPoint presentations of the speakers and the Twitter waterfall. That means that as long as you're connected, and I'm sure many of you have laptops and smartphones and so on, you can immediately react and put up your ideas there. You can say things like, what a great idea, or what a boring lecture. Yeah? It's not moderated, and that's why we have only one rule, and that is not to use strong language. But apart from that, you can say things like, I'm about to go and fall asleep. And we will see it immediately there. The second thing is that everything is being recorded. There's one camera on the speaker at the moment, that would be me, but there are also two cameras pointing at the audience. So we can also see you, and we can keep records. Yeah, we can keep the records to share afterwards with people that could not make it to be here today.
And the NSA.
Hopefully not. We also, in the course of organizing this conference, I discovered that many of our students have many talents. So I discovered that a student is a professional photographer. That's Shruti. Thanks for coming. And he will be getting pictures of you all the time and without announcing them, which I hate, but I guess that's the way to do it. So you will see him around. We also have several journalists that you will see walking around the building with cameras and photographs, cameras for filming and photographing, and so on. Well, don't be afraid of them. A practical announcement is that this used to be the post office building, and it's square. So if you get lost at any point in this building, you keep walking, and you will come back to the point where you started. It's also very symmetric. So at both sides, in the corridors, you will find toilets in every floor. Every floor has the same design. On another point, and before I kick off the conference, I would like to make 1 minute of silence for Sandra Magallanes, who died last week. Sandra was one of the main funders and thinkers and mothers, in a way, of the Banco Palmas in Brazil. And many of you might have met her in Lyon. She cannot come anymore. But I would like to invite everyone to make a minute of silence for her now. Thank you. There are some delegates of Banco Palmas with us today. We really hope the organization pulls through this little crisis as well. And going back to the things on which we can actually do something is the problem of the community forge. Will Rudik was going to be here, but he was first imprisoned, and then his passport was retained. He cannot come, and we really should or could do something, take some action, we're going to offer a petition that can be signed outside. Can you stand? Because your team is going to organize. You're not organized yet, but you will be by tomorrow, perhaps? So everybody that would like to sign this petition of support that will go to the Central Bank of Kenya is very much welcomed and invited to take action, because it's one of the small weapons that we can use against people that consider that this community currency system is something illegal, forging money or challenging the monopoly of the state, which is perhaps what we would actually like to do. But we don't say it like that. I will pass right now to Wendy Harcourt. She will introduce the Civic Innovation Research Initiative. That's the research group in which this conference is housed or hosted. Thank you. I forgot one thing. We would very much like to make this a very green conference. So I would like to explain why you got an empty bag. There are all kinds of flyers, maps, materials, etc. you can pick up for free in the table. But the point is, take it only if you're going to take it back home. Don't leave it in your hotel room creating more waste, like we do in many conferences. So you're invited to fill that bag with what you want. And one of the things that you can take is the ISS cookbook. We have students from 50 plus countries in this building all the time, and they have contributed recipes from their countries. So you will find something very interesting for those that like cooking and have fun with tasting different stuff. So you're invited to simply fill that with your things.
That's just some contact information. There is, I've already posted the lecture, which is 9,000 words on my website, and that's a link. But you can get to it quite easily, but it's the first one on the shorter URL. I was very interested listening to Catherine Gibson. There are some tremendous similarities between our perspectives, especially I think the emphasis on plural or diverse economies and on returning the economy to the level of people as they live in the places they live in. And there was other. They're quite. You will also, I hope, be struck by some of the contrasts between us. While I was listening to her talk, I was struck how valuable it is to focus on the ethics of economy, as she did, and which you will see I don't, not as directly. And for me, the problem has always been, how do we connect small-scale activities, initiatives on the ground with the larger social processes that are making our world? And my talk will be an attempt, if you like, to situate the problem of money at that level. But of course, there's always the chance, and in fact, I think you'll agree with me that it was achieved in my talk, that won't lose sight of the perspective of people in their everyday activities, which I think she kept a very firm gaze on. So we're complementary, maybe in some ways contradictory, who knows. I have 5 sections. Well, they're fairly... that's just to give you a map to the talk. These people have done recto verso, if you'll believe it. So I'm sure that I'll miss a slide at some point, but I hope I can just about see what each one should be. Okay, let's start with my history with Let's. I mean, I think all my life, certainly since I was 5 years old, I've been anxious to learn about money and in practical and theoretical ways. Mainly, my main avenue to a practical engagement with money was betting on the horses, which I started when I was 12, and which financed a good part of my passage through university. And when I did my doctorate, I became a kind of petty gangster in the slums of Accra, or I would call it, an entrepreneur. I had the problem when I wrote my PhD of how to present my best material, which was the stuff I'd done myself, as if it happened to somebody else. I also made a small fortune from riding the inflation of the 70s through buying and selling houses, and then lost it when my marriage collapsed. When I was in the States, I took my betting philosophy and practice to cocoa futures in New York, and finally dollar Deutschmark exchange rate futures in Chicago. And for the last decade, as I've lived in many countries, I've become essentially an FX trader. I have a dozen accounts oh no, I better not say that, it's being recorded. Anyway, I bet on foreign exchange because since the bastards reduced, I didn't want to invest in property or assets, stocks, because I was sure we were in a bubble, and there was no interest on savings. And I saw there were these massive fluctuations in foreign exchange, and so I decided that I would use my liquidity, as it were, to bet on that. All of these are ways of inserting myself practically into the monetary economy. I'm also, and have been for a long time, concerned with African development, and in the 1990s, I became involved in a number of countries going through crisis, Rwanda, South Africa, Nigeria, and especially Angola. And I've always had this question, I mean, given, especially then and less so now, Africa's situation in the world economy, how one might address the question of global economic inequality, and especially of Africa's place in that system. And so I've always had this desire to push my work and analysis to a level that might be capable of embracing the crisis in world civilization. I wrote a paper some time ago called Heads or Tails, Two Sides of the Coin. I won't summarize it, but my main argument was that Western economies seem to oscillate ruinously between monolithic state-based approaches to money and monolithic market-based approaches to money, when it was obvious from the heads and tails of a coin that states and markets are complementary, at least in that form of money. And this is really one of the main points of my talk, which is that politics tends to disappear from the discussion of markets. This is obviously part of the technique of neoliberal brainwashing, but it's also something that many people in the alternative circuit subscribe to by searching for markets, if you like, that would be self-sustaining without articulating their political framework. And that's one of the main themes of my talk. I published a book, The Memory Bank, around the millennium, in which, broadly speaking, I argued that the internet, the digital revolution in communications, could be a basis for greater economic democracy, and in particular the electronic money forms had the potential, if not always the practice, to shift power from the producers of money to its users. And after writing that book, I joined with Michael Linton, who is very well known to you all, and his sidekick, Ernie Jacob. And for two years or so, we set about trying to write a book on LETS. And in the course of this, we had all kinds of adventures. We were involved in the Japan Open Money Project, which was a collaboration of democratic organizations and advertising corporations. We went to Berlin to the Wizards of OS and looked at the relationship between community currencies and the free software open source movement. This was also the time in which Trueque in Argentina flourished, the Credito. And I was also involved quite heavily in the promotion of Système d'échange local in France. I live in Paris, by the way. Okay. I mean, Michael's approach to LETS is not everyone's, but it's something that appealed to me because he argued that he has always argued that LETS systems should be integrated with the commercial and political economy, and that standalone individual initiatives have not much of a future, and we should be using the internet to help large numbers of community currencies interact through a platform, a money domain name system. He also developed smart cards that were capable of holding 15 currencies at once, so that with the idea that people would be members of many organizations of this kind, reflecting their different interests. And of course, you know that the main focus of LETS is on creating a locally closed circuit of exchange. And so there is a kind of dialectical contradiction in the development of LETS if it is to be capable of scaling up to a larger, wider level. So there is a dialectic of local community, which is very well articulated in the design of the program, but there's also the attempt to create global networks that could scale up these activities and let them talk to each other, even interact and exchange with each other. And you know, I was struck when writing this book and working with Eric and, not Eric, with Michael and Ernie, I was struck by the kind of barbed nature of the pair open and closed, because Michael's line is that the danger of normal money is that it's open and the money goes anywhere, and that LETS allows the money to circulate in a closed circuit where it will not leak away. And also he calls these monies, normal money, closed in the sense that it is issued by a single agency, at least formally by a central bank or whatever, whereas what he calls open money is open to anyone. Everybody issues the money simply by entering into transactions within this circuit. So, I mean, but I don't think it's obvious which of these two kinds of money you would call open or closed. I mean, clearly each of them organizes a dialectic of openness and closure in a different way. And I think in the end, we dropped the book. And there were many reasons for that, mainly mine, I'm sure. But I think because we construct the notion of openness and closure in different ways, and I came to feel that in some ways the closure of local currency systems was fighting what money is best for, which is opening up and extending our relations with the world. I also found it frustrating that people were so reluctant to embrace these systems for the very obvious reason that we are so deeply socialized by old money that it's very hard to shake people. I mean, basically, if you say, look, I mean, what have you been doing with your life? I mean, you've been sacrificing yourself to a system of money that actually treats you very badly, and all you had to do was make your own money. And people say, well, that sounds great. And then they think, what, am I a sap or what? I mean, and people are not very happy to acknowledge that they've wasted their lives following a system of money that actually is irrational and hurts them. So there is some resistance to adopting. It's like, I mean, I'm a betting man. I always have been. I've made a lot of money from betting. And I say, and I say to people, that people say, I say, I make money from betting. They say, no, you can't, because it's only the bookies and the casinos who win. I mean, gamblers always lose. I mean, they have to say that because if you could actually win from gambling, why work? I mean, this is the, but the fact is you can, I know. And, but anyway. So but this is a real problem. How do you get people? And I didn't think that Michael's pitch, which was basically to show them how different Let's money was from the money that they knew, was the best way of getting them over the hump. Because I have a kind of English notion that if you want to win, you kind of accept some of the premises of your enemy and then kind of overturn them by extending them. You don't confront them with something that you claim is the opposite of what they already know and do. But in addition to that, people, I would argue, and I'll explain it more fully later, in some way the idea of national community, which we have absorbed so thoroughly in the modern period, shapes how people imagine setting up their own money systems. They actually set them up as mini nation states, and they become in some way a central bank to the extent that they organize the money in particular ways. But they conceive of money as a standalone, bounded, local system, which is what, of course, national money is in the first place. So it's very difficult to break away from the forms that we've already internalized. And what interests me, and I mean, of all the writers on money that appeal to me, Georg Simmel's Philosophy of Money, which he wrote in 1900, I like Simmel because, I mean, this is the time when Tönnies, for example, was saying, oh my God, you know, Gesellschaft, Gemeinschaft, the people have been ripped out of little local communities and pitchforked into the anonymous crowds of the city. And, you know, and it's all terrible, and we've got to go back to Gemeinschaft and so on. And he said, well, thank God for the crowds in the city. I mean, who wants all these people knowing everything that you do? I mean, I'm glad to be invisible and to be myself there. That appealed to me, too. I mean, I never romanticized what it's like to live in a closed local community where everybody knows your business. So when Simmel says that money is a concrete symbol of human ability to make universal society, I say, you know, I'll drink to that. But also, I think there's a false opposition between, in some people's minds, not everyone in this movement, between relations at distance, which are virtual, and more direct and face-to-face encounters, which obviously, by definition, are local. And so my project is all based on the idea that this digital revolution that we're living through, and we're really in the early stages of it, will not be finished or will not be satisfied until we can replicate at distance most of what we experience in face-to-face encounters. And obviously we're a long way away from that. But that's my interest is in combining the virtual and the exotic with the local and the familiar. Now I'm going to go on to the euro crisis. I mean, I go on to the euro crisis because I want to connect with, why we, what we are in here, and many people here are in that. I wrote an article in 2002, which was the year in which the notes and coins of the euro were issued, and also there was this big crisis going on in Argentina concerning the peso. I called it a tale of two currencies. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And I argued that both of these phenomena were a response to the same problem, which is the need for new solutions for national currencies facing global markets. And I also argued that the euro may look all right now, but just wait. I mean, there'll be a day when the euro, people with the euro are going to be going through what the Argentinians are going through now. I was, at least it was not with the benefit of hindsight. I argued essentially, and it wouldn't be any surprise to you, that single currencies can't handle economic diversity. And moreover, that the euro, which is really a throwback to the gold standard and then the Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate system, is intrinsically deflationary, was designed to be deflationary. Of course, that aspect of the euro was concealed during the credit boom when anybody could get money. And so I argued that, at some stage, these intrinsic problems of the euro would become obvious, and then there would be an accelerated demand for more flexible monetary instruments, for plural, multiple currencies. Now, I mean, my analysis of this is that the euro was established through the Treaty of Maastricht in 1991 in the immediate aftermath of the end of the Cold War. And there was a great euphoria, if you like, that free market capitalism had won the Cold War, which I think was a misinterpretation. And it led to two huge political blunders. One was the former Soviet Union essentially handing over the economy to gangsters and oligarchs in the name of privatization without any of the frameworks of public law and organization that shore up market economies in the West. And of course the European Union, the idea that you can approach political union through a free market. In other words, it's the idea that markets are logically prior to political efforts at political union. This is the opposite of the way the Americans did it, for example. I mean, they fought this horrible bloody war for 4 years before they could centralize their currency, and it still took them 50 years to gain complete acceptance for it. The Europeans imagined they could create political union through a free market that in which there were no fiscal mechanisms that were shared, where huge regional divergences were not addressed, and so on and so forth. And it's my belief that in this world economic crisis, and I have no doubt that we're going through a world economic crisis and by no means have yet reached the worst of it, it's Europe that is going to be the major and permanent loser of all the regions in this. And because they still can't see what it is that they did wrong 20 years ago. So the problem in the world crisis, and in Europe in particular, is not principally one of credit and debt, but it's about a major change which is taking place in global political economy, and it's manifested in the discrepancy between national political organization and global and lawless circuits of money. The big mistake with the euro was to replace national currencies with this single currency. There was an alternative on the table. It was called the hard ECU, or economic, what was it called? Economic currency unit. No, European currency unit. In this one, there will be a low inflation central bank based on the model of the Bundesbank, and countries would retain their national currencies and they would be floated side by side. One of them would be anti-inflation hard currency, and the other would be a politically manipulated national currency, and they would have to figure out their relationship with each other. Now, in fact, countries like the United Kingdom and Switzerland enjoy this system already by not being in the euro. They have complete open access to euro markets, but they also have retained the right to politically manipulate their own currency. And this is not just something limited to national currencies. I mean, what I call techno-utopian projects like Bitcoin, which imagine that you can create a kind of free money market through mathematical innovation without any explicit political organization. These two, are essentially dreaming of apolitical markets in the same way as the European Union is. And of course, as we all know, the consequence of being hooked into the Eurozone is that devaluation is no longer an option, which only leaves two others, deflation or default. And of course, the price of either is, well, deflation is the preferred policy, and default is discouraged, you might say. And of course, in pursuing this line at all costs, there is a huge democratic deficit, which is becoming more and more explicit as the years go on. And it becomes more and more obvious that governments are only listening to the interests of finance. And as a result, Europe's rulers push inexorably along a path of social polarization between, on the one hand, and the winning side so far, corporate bureaucracy, and people who are being cumulatively stripped of the rights and powers that they won after 1945 in the 3 decades of social democracy. I mean, quite nakedly and viciously. And this is, I would argue, a Greek tragedy in both the ancient and the modern sense. The problem of the euro cannot be fixed because the mistake, as it were, the hamartia in Aristotle's terms, was made long ago. And whatever people think they're going to do about it, they will fail. I mean, this is the Oedipus story, and also the Greeks are here today to remind us of what it actually concretely means in terms of the plight that has been forced onto a people. Okay. How am I doing? Okay. Now, I would argue that this system that we're looking at in disarray should be seen in the context of the history of money, the modern history of money. And for that, I use the term for the dominant economic form of the last century or more, national capitalism. And this has been unraveling since the dollar was depegged from gold in 1971. But the consequences of this, again, were disguised by the credit boom. For me, national capitalism is the institutional synthesis of nation states and industrial capitalism, whose main symbol is a national monopoly currency. That is, legal tender policed by a central bank. I define national capitalism as the attempt to manage money, markets, and accumulation through central bureaucracy within and in the interests of a cultural community of national citizens. This was actually Hegel's recipe in the philosophy of right. He argued that capitalism could only be moderated by the state in a particular form, and this was more or less his version of it. The origins of national capitalism lay in a series of political revolutions of the 1860s and early 70s. These included, most importantly, the American Civil War. I mean, the basic point about these revolutions is that the world economy wasn't all that integrated at the time. I mean, Arthur Lewis reckons that international trade accounted for less than 1% of the economy of most countries. But all the major players in 20th century history had political revolutions within a decade. The American Civil War, the abolition of serfdom in Russia, the Risorgimento in Italy, the Meiji Restoration in Japan, German unification, the Franco-Prussian War, the French Third Republic, the Second Reform Act in Britain, and the formation of the Anglo-Indian superstate by Britain. And this was essentially an alliance between two classes that had been opposed in the bourgeois revolution, that is, capitalists and the traditional enforcers, the military landlord class. In every case, these two sides came together in order to construct states that could manage a rapidly urbanizing world of industrial workers and criminal gangs. And once they got together, they began building a world in which governments and corporations could coexist in some mutual relationship. And this was founded on the dominant trend of the late 19th century, which is a bureaucratic revolution paving the way towards mass production and consumption. Now, I mean, I have to emphasize how serious an antagonist the nation state is as a social form. It is incredibly powerful. I mean, when you think it's only been around in its modern form for a century, maybe a century and a half, and yet most of us are incapable of imagining society in any other way than through this national form. And I believe its power comes from the fact that it synthesizes 5 different notions of community. It's a political community, it's a community of place or territory, it's a virtual or imagined community, it's a community of interest in trade and war, and it's a monetary community, as symbolized by the national currency. So for me, an analysis of the rise and fall of single currencies is an index of national capitalism's historical trajectory. Now, I've drawn a great deal on a small paper of Karl Polanyi published in 1964 called Money Objects and Money Uses. And in that, he talks about these national monopoly currencies as all-purpose money. And he says that all-purpose money uniquely combines the traditional 4 functions of money: medium of exchange, means of payment, standard of value or unit of account, and the store of wealth. He says that before the modern emergence of national monopoly currencies, these uses, he prefers the word to functions, were actually spread between different monetary instruments, and that they didn't. There is therefore not a history of money, a singular history of money, because in fact it takes so many different forms before this particular synthesis. And this synthesis, as I said, is recent, but I would argue, going beyond Polanyi, that it has been breaking up since the early 70s. And as a result, these functions of money are no longer held in particular symbols, as they once were, but are separated between many types of monetary instruments issued by a global distributed network of corporations, and not just governments and banks. Now, I have a very an extended treatment of why national capitalism is collapsing. But one of the main reasons, and I can't go into it here, is that neoliberal deregulation has actually taken away the post-war political and legal framework for the management of money, at the same time as the internet and various other features have accelerated and expanded the global circulation of money. And this has led to a wholesale informalization of the world economy, not just little African city dwellers in slums, but the whole range. I've got an article on my website called How the Informal Economy Took Over the World. And if you want to follow that up, you can find it there. Now, I turn again to Simmel, Georg Simmel, and he asked, really, what is it that money rests on? What is its anchors? What are its anchors? And he says, the anchors are twofold: the physical substance, the stuff that we can kind of hold and touch, and the community of users. That is, between buyers and sellers, there is always a third party present in a market transaction, which is the community of users of the currency. And he felt that this kind of material conception of money would give way as money became dematerialized, and society would become more visible as the source of money. Now, obviously, the digital revolution has done, I mean, it's quite a reasonable prophecy of Simmel, but where is society now? I mean, arguing that the ability to locate society automatically in the nation state is failing us. And so I conclude this section by arguing that all economies throughout history are pulled in two directions. They are pulled inwards to secure local guarantees of a community's rights and interests, but they're also, because they're never self-sufficient, they are pulled outwards into engaging with others. And the function of money and markets traditionally has always been to manage these processes of foreign extension. Now I'm going to talk about the human economy. This is a book. Nobody reads it. I don't blame them, actually. It's too dense. But you could, you know, I put a lot of effort into this book. It's but nobody buys it, and I'm going to do it in a comic form next time. Then my daughter would read it. Anyway, so I run a research program in University of Pretoria, South Africa, on the human economy. And we follow several strands of where things are going in contemporary economics, especially heterodox economics. First of all, we want to reconnect the study of the economy to the real world. Secondly, we want to make our findings more accessible and useful to the public. And third, and this is the very difficult one, we want to place economic analysis within a framework that embraces humanity as a whole, That is the world that we live in now. That's the difficult thing. If the national framework that broke up the idea of world society and left it at the kind of national borders, if that is failing, how are we going to establish some conception of how we belong to each other at a planetary level? And my argument essentially is that markets and money are quite a good way of doing that, but the forms that they appear in these days are often not all that desirable. Our program came out of 10 years of work mainly by Latin American and Francophone scholars in the outer globalization movement, collaborations between researchers and activists. And what we tried to do in Pretoria, we've been going now for almost 3 years, is to fill two gaps. One was, there were in all of the series of books that came out, there were almost no Africans or Asians, which is where all the people are. And so one point was to establish a Southern African node in this international outer globalizing network, and to broaden the range of South-South, North-South dialogue by actually adding some Africans and Asians to what the Latin Americans more or less had a monopoly of for some time. The second thing is that there's a lot of talk about what to do and so on, but we have not been able to find many guides to how to do research on these questions, and so we have postdocs and PhD students, and a good deal of our concern, although we have political goals in mind, is to develop research tools for investigating what people do. Okay, I'll skip the first point, which is much too broad for you, I think. I don't know. What I argue is that it still is important at some level for us to engage with questions of human universals, what it is that human beings have in common, an old kind of question of anthropology, and that the new human universal isn't an idea, it is the fact that we share this planet and lack the means of association for doing so effectively. The main point of the Human Economy Program, wait a minute, have I? Yes, I have. I was talking, see, I said I would do it at least once. Because it's recto verso, I skipped a page. Okay, all right. So our methods. So what are our methods? First of all, our methods are humanist, which isn't so difficult given the anti-humanist tendencies of existing economic analysis, which is we need to return economy from the experts to the people. Okay, you all agree with that. That means, first of all, our first technique of research is ethnography. We have to join the people where they live to discover what they do, think, and want. Secondly, the economy is always plural, diverse, as Catherine says, complex, and we must address the variety of institutions that shape economic experience for particular people. And we need to try and help them to organize and improve their own lives by making things, our findings, accessible to them. But we also, and this is the difficult part, we need an economic vision capable of bridging the gap between everyday life and humanity's common predicament, which is impersonal and lies beyond the actor's point of view. So what I'm trying to do here, which may strike some people as odd or even wrong, is to try and develop in this concept of the human economy a way of integrating small-scale humanism with large-scale impersonal institutions, both public and private. So what that means is that we have to develop strategies which are anchored in people's local lives, but at the same time are capable of being extended beyond the limits of what they know towards the global. And the chief way, as I've already indicated, of achieving social extension has always been through markets and money in various forms. I mean, with the emphasis on the various forms. So then I asked myself, well, what is if you say a human economy, what is an economy? And I argued that an economy is a strategy, that all the dominant forms of economy, Islamic, Buddhist, Christian, ancient Greek, bourgeois, communist, and so on, have essentially carried a message about what you should do. I mean, you can identify the economy by the principle that it says should guide how you organize your economic life. In other words, an economy is not just an ideology or a kind of realistic description. It's an attempt to guide people in some fairly broad and inclusive way. And the second feature of the human economy is that we must draw on social and technical conditions today as they are, that is, the rapid growth of cities, fast transport, universal media. We can't develop these things, our economic solutions, as if these things did not exist. And indeed, otherwise we would be reverting to a kind of William Morris utopian socialism that took refuge from capitalism in small-scale, face-to-face encounters. I guess this makes me, in a weird way, a Marxist. I mean, the Marxists really did believe that whatever socialism is, it has to make sense of and use of the most advanced social and technical conditions of the day. And so this is a really quite abbreviated, but what I attempt to do in the concept of the human economy is to synthesize some of the previous forms which emphasized the house or the market or the nation, or now increasingly the world, and conceive of these as coexisting in a process of social extension, which is always locally rooted, but which aspires towards the global. My last section is based on what I think is the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is that we all believe that people should do it for themselves. We all believe that self-organized democratic initiatives at the grassroots are wonderful and we need to support them. But they are ephemeral and vulnerable and often chaotic. And on the other hand, we have these bureaucratic institutions, governments, corporations, and so on, which is easy to demonize, as I have in my past, and which are powerful in terms of technological and organizational resources and, of course, money, and which have great longevity, as well as possibly being over-rigid and perhaps evil, but who knows. My question then is, how can we seek to achieve greater economic democracy by bringing these two together? And I just want to finish with some very brief examples. I mean, the first one is that the city of Nantes was the big slaving shipping capital of France, the main port of France. It supported the Republic in a desperate civil war, the War of La Vendée. Why? Because they saw the revolutionaries might open up feudalized conditions for transport for their trade goods. The industrialists of Milan and Turin supported the Risorgimento because they wanted to escape from Austrian protectionism and to win free access to the world market as well as to a consolidated home market. I mentioned already how some Japanese corporations have been involved with Let's activists. I mean, you're all familiar with M-Pesa in Kenya, which is essentially enabled by a subsidiary of Vodafone. Of course, now there are many people saying, isn't this a problem? It's a monopoly, etc. I've always been impressed by Hewlett-Packard's decision to try and adapt their computers to the world's poorest 4 billion by setting up research centers. And one thing you may know about Kenya from the point of view of M-Pesa, but Kenya is also the world leader in recycling cheap old computers for use by poor people. And that was, to some extent, enabled by these Hewlett-Packard inventions. You're going to hear plenty at this conference about community development banking in Brazil, which again is bringing the power of national bureaucracy towards local democratic institutions based on microcredit and complementary currencies. One of my favorite examples is the 3C invoice circuit in Uruguay. Uruguay is one of the few places left where the utilities are still nationalized. And they wanted to set up a circuit which would allow small and medium enterprises to use unpaid invoices to, in some liquid way, to buy what they needed. And the great innovation was that they threw in local taxes and telephone and electricity and water bills and said we would accept these things in payment of that. Well, I mean, one of the big problems with these circuits is if you're a big player, I mean, what are you going to use these things for? Babysitting, you know, or what? But if you can pay your water and telephone bills, then you will accept them. And this has been a very successful scheme. Finally, something that I know about directly, e-invoice banking in South Africa. This has, again, is aimed at small and medium enterprises. There are something like 200,000 black SMEs in South Africa, and they all have liquidity problems, slow cash flow and all that kind of. And this is designed essentially to speed up payment. Basically, there's a software and a network served. It has to be, it's integrated into the banking system. So there has to be a fifth based on 4 clearing systems, and basically suppliers of services and people who issue the invoices agree that the invoice is valid, and this is validated by the bank, and then it can be used for a whole variety of purposes, including cash and various other possibilities. I'm pretty close. It's okay, don't worry. The good point about this is it's decentralized. It doesn't affect the banking system. It's an intermediary in the banking system, and it doesn't require new regulations or political support. But at the same time, although it's aimed at SMEs, there's a problem setting up these networks for small players. You know what it's like. So they're also going to Nestle's and Walmart and saying, we have a system that is actually smarter, faster, quicker, and cheaper than your own accountancy devices. And if you agree to use our system, you know, we'll give you a less than usual discount rate. And some of these are now buying, and that, of course, provides capital to develop the network and bring the small players in. It's like Amazon, really, which has blockbuster bestsellers and the long tail of 1 million small books. So basically, I would argue, the innovation that really seeks to address the economic problems that we're familiar with on an appropriate scale does require, in some instances, high-tech organizational resources that lie beyond the reach of grassroots networks. And the question is how to hook them up without one killing off the other. And in the case of this invoice system, it succeeds to some extent because it's able to achieve low cost of individual operations, it's easily integrated into existing bureaucratic systems, and it's able to operate on the full range of economic activities. I have a final, of course, it's always the person and the woman who gets left out. But I was going to tell you a bit about that this isn't just about businesses and or whatever. It's about people. And, you know, there's a woman called Linda who's a domestic worker in Durban, and she's in her late middle age. And she once was a factory worker, but they closed it down. She has sons, but they're unemployed and drifted into drugs and crime. She has a brother who has AIDS, so she has to feed and buy the school uniforms for his daughters. She has a mother who's crippled but gets a state pension. She travels to work in informal taxis. She belongs to a prosperity church. She's in a savings club. She's over here in debt to moneylenders. And doesn't have a bank account. She sells cosmetics in her spare time in her neighborhood to make some extra income. Now, I mean, this is an incredible life. She knows that life better than anyone. Nobody can tell her about that life. But there are questions that she also asks. Why is it that the men don't work in the mines anymore? Why is it that the schools are failing? Why is it that we have a black government and inequality and poverty is greater than it ever was? These are questions, you know, that go beyond. The first part is what she knows, and she couldn't do what she does without money. I mean, money is extremely important to enable her to manage this incredible plethora of expenditures and income sources and so on. She couldn't do it without that. But she's, you know, so she knows what she knows. But there's all of us live under the threat of catastrophe, of natural disasters, political revolutions, wars, economic depressions, and people need to be able to connect to that. And, you know, although I'm at a very early stage, I still believe that focusing on money as a way of articulating these extremes of human experience is one way of going about that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Georgina, and welcome to everybody. I'm here to really formally welcome you on behalf of my colleagues of the new research group, which is the Civic Innovation Research Initiative. And this is really the first CIRI conference, so we're very excited about that. And you may have noticed there's one more logo amongst the many logos on your conference program, and that's our very brand new CIRI logo, which we're also pleased that this is the first conference, which sort of marks a beginning. And I think those of you who are market-minded might want to think about why the logo is so important in terms of us presenting ourselves. So let me explain just a little bit about what is the CIRI, as we call it. It's basically it's not a research program, it's an initiative. We've got 3 years to prove ourselves at the ISS that the work we're doing is important and relevant. Because in a sense, we're not a traditional development research program in that sense. We're really looking at how organizations and individuals mobilize to change their societies and co-shape them in relation to political, economic, and cultural trends. So we're really trying to be on the, if you like, cutting edge, critical edge of what is development, and particularly what is it that civil society is contributing to the engagement in development. That's not to say that ISS hasn't done that. There's a strong home for that sort of work. But CIRI really aims to sort of put it on the map and make ISS a vibrant intellectual home that really fuses academic and activist concerns around citizenship struggles for equality, respect for cultural difference, political and economic and social justice. And in that, CIRI's research agenda really is striving to look at the different diversity, the inventiveness and originality of people as they really remodel institutional arrangements towards social justice outcomes. So you can hear, as Leo, our rector, said, it's a very ISS is really looking at sort of the politics of how to take forward development and also how to change it. And CIRI has decided to do that through three strands: markets, politics, gender and sexuality. So using these three entry points, we're really going to look at how civic action is responding to some of the major concerns of our times, which include state fragility, escalating and destabilizing inequalities, illegal migration, xenophobia, economic volatilities, intercultural conflicts, sexual violence and gender injustice. So you can hear we're taking on a big agenda, and in this we're very excited that this first conference is going to take the market, a very important institution that we want to co-shape and rethink, and to understand it in relation to the demonetization of the economic transactions, work that you know yourselves very well. Myself, I'm contributing more to the gender and sexuality strand, but one of the challenges of CIRI is to bring in how gender, how politics and how markets have to be looked at together. And I know that Kathy Gibson and some of her work is precisely doing that. So again, very exciting that she's opening up this conference and also the first CIRI conference. So I hope, and I'm pretty sure, looking at the program, that this event will really set the pace for CIRI in the next years, 3 years, we hope more, where it's bringing together the research on civic innovation by academics, by policymakers and practitioners and activists to really exchange knowledge. And in this case, you're looking, and I'm going to certainly learn a lot about the issue of sustainability and diversity of money. Despite my Australian accent, I actually have been living in Italy for many years, and right now at this time of crisis, I'm very aware that time banks, bartering, the whole issue of tickets for meals, all sorts of alternative community economies are really necessary at the moment to overcome some of the crises that Italy is facing, both in terms of its crisis-ridden economy, but also the failing governance system. So again, in terms of the sort of practical use and the excitement of this conference for me is really to listen and hear what are some of the alternatives coming from around the world that I hope I can also bring back into some of the community practices I'm involved in Italy. So on that note, thank you all very much for coming. On behalf of my CIRI colleagues, again, we really do want to recognize the work of Georgina Gomez, who has really done a tremendous job in putting together this event and bringing together all these different networks. And I'm really looking forward to learning a lot in these next days. Now, I also have the tremendous pleasure to introduce Kathy Gibson. I have known Kathy for the last 10 years or more, I'm not even, probably more, working with her on different ways of actually rethinking the politics of development. And she has done her work until 2 years ago, writing together with Julie Graham in a pen name of J.K. Gibson Graham, some very important work with their books, Post-Capitalist Politics, and the earlier book, The End of Capitalism as We Knew It, A Feminist Critique of Political Economy. This work for me has been really vital when I've been working as an activist, as a feminist, trying to understand alternative economies, alternatives to capitalism. And I was just discussing with my colleague Rosalba Ikazara over here about how coming from another angle, this type of work speaks both to academic researchers and to practitioners. And this for me is why it's a very important thing that Kathy is opening the conference. And I know that she's going to be working, talking to you from her latest book that she did with Julie and also with Stephen Healy, which I'm sure she'll say also more about. So this is really cutting edge work, very exciting work. It's innovative, it's about civic innovation, and it's also about rethinking markets, rethinking capitalism, culture and politics. So we really have it all in one with Kathy's presentation. So I'm very much looking forward to it. And don't you dare tweet up there, I'm falling asleep. You're not going to be falling asleep, you're going to be saying, now this is the way I'm going to be doing work from now on. So good luck, Kathy, and thank you very much, everybody.